Our second scripture today is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 2, verses 13 to 23. I'll bet you've never heard this passage read in church before. Now, after they had left, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt. Remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother by night, and went to Egypt. Remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." When Herod saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he was infuriated. And he sent and killed all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had learned from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation. Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they are no more. When Herod died, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those seeking the child's life are dead." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was ruling over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And after being warned in a dream, he went away to the district of Galilee. There he made his home in a town called Nazareth, so that what had been spoken through the prophets might be fulfilled. He will be called a Nazarene. I have a confession to make. I have often told you that the reason I preach from the lectionary is because it forces me to choose passages that normally I would not choose. It keeps me from picking just the ones I like. And the implication is in that statement that that happens a lot, that it tunnels me in a direction that maybe I wouldn't choose to go. And that's sort of true. It certainly does push me sometimes in directions that I wouldn't particularly choose, but the truth is, when the scripture passages are particularly ugly or weird, I don't pick them. And if I'm saying in the lectionary, there are 4 choices every Sunday. There's an Old Testament passage or a history passage. There's a poetry passage, usually from the Psalms. There's an epistle from the letters in the New Testament and a gospel passage. So I've got 4 choices on any given Sunday. But the truth is that there are occasionally times when I don't even pick one of those 4. When none of them feel right, so I go outside the lectionary altogether. And you've also heard me say we're Baptists, we can do whatever we want. That's how I justify that to myself. I'm a Baptist, I can do whatever we want. Indeed, most Baptists don't even know what the lectionary is, let alone choose from it to preach. Generally, in the free church tradition, pastors just pick the passages they want to pick. Today's passage is a particularly ugly and difficult one. Now, you remember the lectionary goes in a 3-year cycle, so this passage comes up every 3 years in the lectionary. I have faced this passage 14 times in my career. I have never preached on it before. I probably have never read it in church before. I usually pick 2 passages. We read one and preach on the other. If we were in the high church, we'd read all 4. But I'm sure I've never picked it. I'm sure. And I would bet that none of you have ever heard that passage read in church before. You may never have read it before. But the truth is that it is an important passage in the church year, to the point that In the high church, there is even a feast day for this passage of Scripture. It was yesterday, I believe, called the Feast of the Holy Innocents. Now, in the high church, feast days are kind of like mini holidays. Mini holidays. And there would have been a special service for it with communion in the high church if they followed all of the feast days. Now, when this lectionary choices come up every 3 years, the other 3 passages, usually the 4 passages, have something that kind of ties them together. This Sunday, they don't. You heard the passage that Nancy read, and then the one that I read, and if you thought about them, your question would have been, why in the world did they put those 2 together? And indeed, the other 2 passages fit with Nancy's passage and not with the one I read. Most years, I've preached on the passage, the epistles. And if you had looked in your calendar for today, you would have seen listed the passage I was planning to preach on, and indeed it was the epistle. It's much easier, much less ugly. Instead, here we are in church on the 5th day of Christmas, and I just read to you about the Holy Family as refugees, about the slaughter of the innocents, with all of the difficult theological questions, and cultural questions, and religious questions in here. You probably can figure out why I've never preached on it before. Well, this past week, again, I was planning to preach on the epistle. I started reading that passage, and it just felt trite. Felt like there wasn't anything that really needed to be said. And then I went and I looked at all of the other lections, and this passage popped out, and I thought, oh man, no wonder I picked that one. And then 2 things happened this week that kind of pushed me. The first is that Cheryl and I have occasionally watched the television, the Netflix series Orange is the New Black. It's based on the memoir of a woman named Piper Chapman who spent some time in prison for transporting narcotics. And she wrote a book about her time in prison, and they made it into a Netflix series. Well, we're in the final, we just finished the final season. It lasted seven seasons. And in the final season, the prison where she's staying gets sold and becomes a for-profit prison. And we all know that one of the things that the for-profit prisons have all been doing is working with ICE to hold people who are awaiting hearings for immigration and for refugee status in the United States. And so there are those folk in the prison, and you get to see some of those relationships. Now, in the last episode, they showed some court scenes. And we've all read about the court scenes and how horrible they are. There were 2 that were heartbreaking. The first was a mother who had been separated from her children, arguing for the judge, before the judge, why she should get her children back. Because she needs to be with her children, and they need to stay in the United States, because if she takes them back, they will be killed by the gangs. And the judge looks at her and says, but they're in foster care here in the United States, so they're safe. And if I give them back to you, I have to send you back, so they'll be killed. So I'm just going to leave them where they are. And you are going back to whatever Central American country it was. That was horrible enough. Then the second scene that they showed was another scene that we also have all read about. It was the day when the small children were in court. And here are 2 children, both preschoolers, 2 or 3 years old, sitting in the defendant's chair. And the judge looks at these 2 small children and says, do you understand why you're here? And one of the children says, I have to go to the bathroom. And then the judge says, I see you don't have a lawyer. I guess that means you're representing yourselves. And you can imagine what comes from that. The second thing that pushed me to this passage this week was a Twitter war that took place. One of the Democratic candidates at Christmas put a tweet that was a greeting for Christmas where he mentioned Jesus as being a poor refugee. And the right, both political and religious, went crazy over that, saying, first off, Jesus wasn't poor, and yes, indeed he was, as Doug Miller used to always remind us. The reason Joseph was a carpenter was because he had lost his land. People didn't choose to become a carpenter. It wasn't a highly skilled, highly paid craft work like we envision it. It was indeed where someone went when they couldn't do anything else. And it is true that technically at the birth of Jesus, he was not a refugee. But as you just heard in today's passage, indeed, the family became refugees. Well, again, the other passages just didn't feel like they had any oomph to them this week. And those two pieces, those two events really got my imagination. And so here we are looking at a passage on which I have never preached before, and there are lots of good reasons why I never chose it. So it begins with the story of the Magi. The Magi have seen this star, and they have read the stars and told them that a king is born. And this king is really something special, special enough that it gets recorded in the heavens. And so they travel to Israel to pay homage to this king. And they go there, and they're smart guys, so they know that when you go to pay homage to a king, you first go to the king who's already there, probably a family member. And you do all the right protocol. And so they go to Herod, and they say, Herod, we've learned that there's a new king that's been born in your land, and we're coming to pay homage. And Herod says, what? What? Now, Herod was not a pleasant guy. He killed 3 of his own sons, so they wouldn't take his role as king. Josephus tells us that. And so Herod says, well, I got to find this kid because I'm going to kill him too. So he says to the wise men, wonderful, I'm so glad that you came and talked to me first. Go and find the child, and when you find the child, when you leave, you come back and tell me so that I can pay homage. And the wise men leave. But they're warned in a dream not to go back to Herod because he's going to kill the child. And so they go a different way, and Herod finds out about that, and he's angry. And he says, you know what? I still got to kill this kid. Don't really have morals about such things, so I'll just go to Bethlehem and we'll kill all the kids who are under age 2. That way I'll be sure to get the right one. And an angel comes to Joseph and says, Joseph, Herod is going to kill all the children. Take Jesus and flee. And so he does. Short version of that, again, is that the government has decided to kill all the children under 2. Joseph, Mary, and Jesus flee across international borders as refugees in order to keep their babies safe. And they wait there in Egypt as illegal aliens until it looks safe to return. Had they not fled, Jesus would have been killed. That simple. The entire story of salvation would have been thwarted. Had they been stopped at the border of Egypt by soldiers from Egypt that sent back home again, the exact same thing would have happened. Had Jesus been Jesus trying to find safety in the United States, you can imagine the story. And as I played with that, I kept being reminded of the number of times in the Old Testament we're told to be hospitable to the aliens. Indeed, in the Old Testament law, it says, "The alien who resides among you shall be to you as a citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens." Now, it's uncomfortable to talk about political things from the pulpit. I know I do it sometimes, and there have been those who've said I do it too often, and I hear that. And there is discomfort about it, because the reality is that we have a variety of political opinions in our congregation. We're a small congregation, but we don't all think alike, and we don't need to all think alike. God is not a Democrat, and God is not a Republican. God isn't even independent. And none of the parties out there have a lock on righteousness. It's that simple. It is that simple. But here's the rub. And here's why there is any discomfort about it at all. Because, it would be easy to say, I'm not going to touch this passage. And indeed, 14 choices, 13 of my 14 times when I've read this passage, I said, you know what? I'm not going to touch this. But there are some issues, there are some moral questions that can only be addressed politically. We were talking about this passage at the dinner table the other night, and Alexis said to me, "What can we do?" It was a really good question. What can we do? And the reality is that as individuals, we can't do anything. We can't do anything. There are little things we can do. There's an organization that collects money to pay bail for people who are waiting their hearings. I think they've paid bail for 80-some people at this point. That's a drop in the bucket. It's a drop in the bucket. We could maybe say, oh yeah, I'm gonna do foster care for some of these kids who are otherwise lying on concrete floors in the cold in cages. But that's not a solution at all. There are real moral issues that impact the lives of real people in the most profound of ways that can only be addressed politically. And immigration is one of them. Now, the only way it can be addressed is through political action. It's not a simple question, and the answers are not clear or easy. And anybody who implies that they are is lying. But anybody who says that the way things are is okay is also wrong. I have a friend who's a chaplain in a federal prison, and he was talking about the children in cages and the way they're being treated. And Chuck said, you realize, of course, that if we treated dogs that way, we'd be in prison for a felony. That the questions are difficult, that the answers are complex, doesn't make it any less necessary. We can't avoid these questions as people of faith. And today's passage reminds me how important the answers are. There was an editorial in the New York Times yesterday. I think it was yesterday, it might have been the day before. Written by an Anglican priest on this passage. He said, "The church calendar calls Christians and others to remember that we live in a world in which political leaders are willing to sacrifice the lives of the innocent on the altar of power. We're forced to recall that this is a world with families on the run, where the weeping of mothers is often not enough to win mercy for their children. More than anything, the story of the innocents calls upon us to consider the moral cost of the perpetual battle for power, in which the poor tend to have the highest casualty rate. Reminds me of the African aphorism that says, when the elephants fight, it's the ants who suffer most. I don't have any easy answers for the question. All I have is the question. And it's a big one. And it's a hard one. And the truth is that whether the Egyptians openly welcomed Joseph, Mary, and Jesus, or if they just didn't even care, didn't even look, didn't even become aware that they were there, in any case, without that possibility, Jesus was dead as a toddler. And we face the same kinds of questions in our world. As people of faith, we have to wrestle, we have to struggle, and we have to call for political action. And again, the answers aren't simple. They're not easy. But they need to be sought and addressed. What a thing to talk about during Christmas. But there it is. There it is. And the lectionary and the history of the church says, you can't close your eyes. Even though your pastor chose not to preach on it 13 times. Even though 13 times your pastor chose not even to read the passage, but to ignore it. Matthew, on the other hand, said, no, this is a story we have to tell. This is a story we have to wrestle with, because we continue to live it each and every day. And it's there.